Hello, class. Good to be with you here again today for this lecture on a topic that is very controversial and maybe a bit uncomfortable. Maybe this is one of the more uncomfortable topics um, that we've talked about in this course. I know from my traditional in-class students, I get feedback that this one is pretty uncomfortable, and yet I had one tell me recently this is kind of fun too. So maybe I won't take that too literally in terms of fun, but maybe that particular student enjoys a little bit of the discomfort and giggles and that sort of thing that often comes with this particular topic. Of course, what is the topic? Well, it's pornography. So you may be asking, Dr. Ball, why in the world are we talking about an issue like pornography in our class, Ethics and Society? Well, because frankly, in the day that we're living in now, I can't think of anything quite more, how would I put it, relevant to issues regarding ethics and society than pornography. Frankly, because for one, it's one of the fastest growing businesses, industry, I should put it, in the last 20 years, especially with the advent of the internet. And we're seeing all kinds of demographic data come out regarding who are the kinds of people that consume pornography. Um, some of those statistics showing that actually the vast majority of men, um, even in the last 2 weeks, have viewed pornography of one type or another. And that raises an interesting point that I should just make right now, because this is going to be the assumption throughout this lecture, is that those who consume pornography, that is, those who view it, who purchase it, who view it, are men. Now, we know that's not the case per se, that there are also women who do. Maybe even some listening to this lecture. You know who you are, right? I mean, it's a thing that men and women both do in terms of consumption, but the vast majority of it is consumed by men. And that's the assumption Altman is working with in his article in favor of pornography, and Susan Bryson in her article that is arguing for the harmful effects of pornography, and thus why pornography should not be something we have in society, because it would be ethically wrong to have it. So let's dig right into the articles themselves. And I just want to, in this lecture, as I do in all of them, just try to summarize and make some comments on these arguments that these particular moral philosophers are giving regarding this issue now, pornography. Altman's title, pretty provocative, isn't it? The Right to Get Turned On. That's the title of his article. And what he wants to argue is that indeed you do have a right to be aroused by whatever it is that would sexually arouse you, including pornography. So the question is, do people have a right to produce and consume porn? A moral right, a human right? And he says yes. And what is it that gives you that right? Well, what it is your, as he puts it, sexual autonomy. Sexual autonomy. This is an important concept. Because you have sexual autonomy, means that you have the right to use contraceptives, or whatever kind you want to use for your own purposes, he says. Also, what gives you the human right to engage in sex inside or outside of marriage. That's the autonomy that gives you the freedom to pick your partner you want to have sex with, your orientation, etc., etc. The word autonomy really means a sort of individual freedom or self-governance, or the ability to self-govern yourself. Remember, autonomy was a really important concept for Immanuel Kant. He thinks that it's because humans are autonomous that they are deserving of respect and have intrinsic value in this sense, which is why he had that second formulation of his categorical imperative, which said that we should never treat each other as a mere means only, but also as an ends, that is, as also people who have the ability to govern ourselves, and people who do govern ourselves. We are that kind of creature. So autonomy, and that should really kind of give us a sense of where Altman's coming from. He's not a virtue ethicist. He's not a utilitarian. He definitely is a sort of Kantian, at least here. He's relying on this sort of overarching moral principle, which he's calling sexual autonomy, as that which is the epitome, the ultimate principle that should guide anything sexually, especially pornography. Now, he does think that sexual autonomy has limits. There's limits to it. Shouldn't have sex with people who don't consent, or pornographic images of people who don't consent, including children, including those who may have some sort of uh, disabilities or conditions that wouldn't allow them to consent to know what they're doing, right? So there's limits here involved, but the limits themselves are on the margins. By and large, people can engage in their own autonomous decisions regarding sex and sexuality. All right, so now how does Altman define pornography? And that's where we got to begin. Yeah, it was stated in a Supreme Court case many years ago, one that had taken up the issue of pornography. One in that court case, one Supreme Court justice was having a bit of a hard time trying to define what pornography is. And the way in which he did it was he pretty much said, well, porn is the sort of thing that you know it when you see it. So not a helpful definition of pornography. But Altman gives us a few pointers to kind of help us understand what it is. Right? On the one hand, we could say, as a sort of starting definition, that it is sexual explicit material, as he puts it, in words or images, which is intended by its creators to excite sexually those who are willing viewers of the material. So probably not a bad way of going about it. I mean, one thing that this initial definition allows us to think about, or affords us the ability to think about, is pornography itself as a sort of commodity, right? So there are people who produce it, sell it, and those who consume it. And by consume, we just mean they're users of it. Just like you have users of automobiles, users of telephones, users of a computer, right? Consumers in that sort of general sense. So porn's a market product where there's producers and there's consumers. People who willingly purchase it, willingly view it. I mean, even if you were to find stuff free online, somebody's paying for it and then recording your IP address or your user data or looking at the cookies on your computer or something, right? They're getting something out of it, right? Nobody's doing this for free. Somebody's paying for it. So there's consumers of it, there's producers of it, and it is a commodity. It is a product. Um, and the key thing that Altman wants to say about what porn is in regards to this definition is regarding its intent. Maybe the best way to define porn is to understand it in terms of what the intent of porn is. And the intent of pornography is to cause sexual arousal in those who consume it. I mean, that's what the buyer expects to get out of it. That's why the buyer consumes it in terms of viewing it, right? Whether photos, movies, what have you. The idea is to get, as Altman's title is, to get turned on. Altman presents a helpful sort of corollary to that in terms of other kinds of ways in which the same sorts of things could be explicitly given, such as in a medical textbook. In pornography, you might have a nude form on one hand, and in a medical textbook, you might have that same nude form presented in a little bit different way. Why? Why would the sex organs be portrayed differently in one than in the other? Well, and again, we can point to, well, what's the intent of these things? A medical textbook's intent, or the intent of having pictures of sexual organs in the medical textbook, is to get people learned, right? To get them educated regarding these sorts of issues as it relates to medicine and the practice of medicine. But pornography, that's not the intent at all, right? The intent is to get people aroused by experiencing this, by viewing it. And as such, it's this intent to arouse that really is the point of pornography and it really defines what pornography is. So let's talk a little bit now more about sexual autonomy itself. And what Altman means when he talks about sexual autonomy, we've mentioned it a little bit already, right? The self-governing of yourself as a free person. You have the liberty to do whatever you want to do. You're autonomous, you're self-governing, especially regarding your sexual morality. Altman pits this notion of sexual autonomy as a kind of, as a principle under capital L liberal morality. So by liberal here, he's not necessarily meaning like versus conservative in terms of like Republican versus Democrat or right wing versus left wing. That's not the intent of how he's using the word liberal here. Capital L liberal really just has to do with the age in which we live coming out of the Enlightenment. The idea that people can self-govern themselves, even at a political level. The United States of America, for instance, is a capital L liberal society. Classical liberalism, which is a phrase that goes back a few hundred years, really explains the sort of society that we have. We don't have a king, we don't have an aristocracy, we don't have a monarchy, that is, we don't have an aristocracy. We don't have any sort of governance of that way, but we govern ourselves in a modern sort of constitutional democracy or constitutional republic. Um, that being the case, right, we are liberal in that sense. We are self-governing. So we can narrow that notion down that under liberal morality now, not liberal politics, but liberal morality, that's going to assert that we as individuals, as Altman says, we have the right to decide for ourselves what we want to do regarding our own sexual activity. As he puts it, the traditional sexual morality, however, posits that people don't have an individual right to guide their own lives sexually, their own sexual choices, their own sexual actions, but rather that there's a set of duties that themselves are kind of up to society, what society says about it, that our own sexual choices, in a sense, belong to the society that we're a part of and not so much ourselves. And maybe there's some truth to that. Maybe in any kind of traditional morality, there is a sense in which the morality itself has to be somewhat of a construct of the society one lives in order that the society may flourish. And so there's no doubt that a lot of our moral sorts of rules and principles that we have are a construct of the communities and societies we live in. I'll give you a good example of that. Um, if you are a male, for instance, here in the Deep South, see what kind of response you get from others if you walk up to a door with, at the same time, like at a grocery market or grocery store, supermarket, something like that, at the same time as a woman who's entering, getting ready to enter that door, and it's not an automatic door, and you refuse to open the door for her, and then do that same thing in, let's just say, somewhere up north, like Minneapolis, right, or New York City, you will experience a different reaction from, given what the particular mores about that sort of behavior is relative to that particular community. And so there's a sense in which, yeah, that there are some mores that are constructed by society. What Altman objects to is that this would apply or should apply to our own sexual choices. Those things are the things that we need to be able to decide for ourselves and not be pressured by traditional sexual morality as if our sexual choices belong to the society in which we live in and not to ourselves. So as he asks the question then, how is it that the capital L liberal, how do they, a classical liberal, a liberal moralist, view pornography and the role, the place of pornography? And as Altman puts it, and I'll quote him, there's nothing inherent in the activities of producing or consuming pornography which raises a presumption that there is some direct unwilling victim of the activities. Consenting adults have the right to do whatever they decide to do, including voluntarily associating for the purpose of sexual arousal. So just like you, it's up to you, and it's ultimately your decision who you have sex with, what kind of contraception you use, etc. It is also up to you whether or not you want to use pornography as part of your sexual autonomy. You have the right to get turned on in that way. It's your right, and you have the right to exercise that as you see fit. Now, Altman then anticipates what he calls feminist criticism. He anticipates some criticisms to his view, and he takes those in turn. So let's look at those quickly here. First of all, somebody might say, okay, yeah, I'm with you, Altman. We do have sexual autonomy. I mean, obviously, it can't be the case that somebody comes to me and tells me who I'm supposed to have sex with against my will or against my wishes. That just sounds pretty messed up. I think we would all agree that that's pretty messed up. At the same time, does that necessarily mean that this sort of sexual autonomy business is limitless? Are there limits to it? The first objection says that indeed there are limits to it when pornography itself contributes to sexual violence. So first of all, then, the first criticism is that, sure, porn violates morality because it contributes to sexual violence. Now here's how Altman responds to that. Right? We could assume, or we could suppose, that there are kinds of porn that have very harmful indirect effects on people. So, there's examples of that. Let's think about, or maybe we don't want to think about them. I don't want to think about them. But as the argument goes, there are some instances, examples of pornography that depict the gang rape of women who play a subordinate role in these scenes, and they are being gang raped on the screen, on a movie set, for the purpose of, right, helping somebody get turned on, I suppose, who's into that sort of pornography. And as a result, you might get examples where people then want to imitate that. And they go out and imitate it. Maybe some of it has to do with those who are unable to separate fiction from reality, or maybe some become addicted to it and they don't want to play it out. Um, there are examples of this. If you ever have a chance to look up online the story of Elizabeth Smart, someone who several years ago was kidnapped, and the testimonial she gives is how that her captor, in front of her, I mean, she's a young girl at this time. I'm not exactly how old she was. I've forgotten that, but definitely I think was under 16 years old, not even 16, who is kidnapped, and her captor is watching violent pornography in front of her. And then after he's watching the scenes, he turns around and depicts them as the best he can with her as she's tied up and held against her will. And Elizabeth Smart has come out and talked about how that pornography made that situation so much worse um, on her, and how here is a real example of somebody who was influenced by this pornography. There's an example of what someone like, who Altman is quoting here, Helen Longino, a philosopher at the University of Minnesota, will say about pornography, that will look at the Elizabeth Smart case. And you can see that pornography itself is indeed harmful. And to quote Longino, she says, porn, especially violent porn, is implicated in the committing of crimes of violence against women. So whatever right somebody might have to sexual autonomy, that right is overridden by the fact that there are just horribly harmful social consequences to having that kind of porn. Here's Altman's response. Okay, well, maybe. And it's interesting that Altman kind of is a maybe on these sorts of things, because Altman never actually says that porn doesn't harm people. He does think, however, that the right to sexual autonomy overrides whatever harms come about as a result. So he's really being a hardcore liberal, or even libertarian, frankly, on this sort of matter, a moral libertarian. Okay, but back to his response now. Okay, so maybe sometimes there's some harm, some indirect harm, maybe even some direct harm regarding pornography. But there's a couple things here that we've got to think about. First of all, if porn really is harmful, we've got to prove that. We need clear evidence that there is a causal connection between the production of violent porn and sexual violence that takes place against women in the real world. But as he notes, the evidence is mixed. And if you're a sciencey kind of person who's listening to this lecture, you've taken some science classes, you know already that in scientific methodology, there's a huge difference between correlation and causation. Right? It's one thing for two things. It's one thing altogether for two things to be correlated. And it's another thing altogether for one of those things to cause the other thing. So for instance, right, maybe you could say that sexual violence is on the rise as a result of the fact that pornography use is on the rise, right? And both of those things are on the rise, culturally speaking. At the same time, right, I mean, that also correlates with the fact that the population is growing. So it would seem that the rise in pornography would necessarily also be the result of the fact that there's just more people and more people and more people, especially more people coming online and consuming pornography in this manner, and even other kinds of violent crimes that aren't related to sex or sex crime. They're also on the rise as well. So there could be other explanations, right? It's not enough to say that the rise in sex crime is a result in the rise of porn, which is similar and related to this second way that Altman's going to respond now to this first criticism. Um, all that's similar to so many of the arguments that are being made about violent video games. So a lot of people want to say that one of the reasons you have such high crime, even mass shootings among young people, has to do with, or a lot of it has to do with, the rise in violent video games. These video games where you go and kill people. There comes to a point to where on these video games, right, killing people on the video game is no longer a thrill, so you've got to kind of take it to the next level and do it in person. And some people end up doing that. And that is akin to the sex crime stuff, right? That the porn itself is no longer a thrill, so you got to get out there and actually do it in real life, right? Actually make it happen. What Altman says is that even if we showed a clear connection, why are we picking out porn itself and hating on it when indeed we have these video games, or we have these what he calls slasher films, these films where women get brutally attacked and killed, and Texas Chainsaw Massacre and Saw and Hostel and right. I can't believe I just remembered all those movie titles. But yeah, these are some pretty messed up horror flicks of people being dismembered, cut up, tortured, right? Just craziness, absolute craziness. So why would we pick out porn and not these other things? And he says if we're doing that, then we're just being a bunch of hypocrites. And people like Longino and Susan Bryson, whose article we're going to look at after we finish talking about Altman's argument, that she's just a big hypocrite too. We're picking out the porn, we're hating on the porn, and not all these other sorts of things. So that's Altman's response to that first criticism. The second criticism would be this. Okay, Altman, you've got a point, right? Everybody has a right to sexual autonomy, yet there are limits to sexual autonomy if pornography contributes to sexual inequality. So that's the question. Does pornography contribute to sexual inequality? And as Altman puts it, many people will say that violent porn helps maintain many social and economic inequalities that disadvantage women. Hence, it's not so much a moral issue, but it's a matter of women's civil rights. So, for instance, think about a case where we can see in examples of the effects of pornography that porn really does oppress women in private settings as well as in public settings, since the vast majority of pornography involves women who are in positions of sexual subordination. They are being tied up, bondaged. Uh, they are being held as a sort of sex slave or as the sort of passive participant in the sex act itself. And what is the purpose of that? Not only on the screen, as Altman quotes Catherine McKinnon, and I actually don't want to come out and quote that quote here on this lecture, but to summarize McKinnon's point on this, what's the point of this porn? It's to help men get off. It's that they receive their or achieve their sexual gratification of themselves, doing this for themselves, relieving themselves while watching women be exposed, humiliated, violated, degraded, mutilated, dismembered, bound, gagged, tortured, and killed. That this is how men get off, men who consume this sort of pornography. So does that contribute to sexual inequality? And of course, someone like Bryson, Longino, McKinnon are going to say yes, it does. And so that goes beyond what sexual autonomy is meant to protect. However, Altman says, again, evidence doesn't show a sort of causation here, or even a correlation between the level of sexual inequality that's in the world, in the real world, and the available of pornography. And what Altman wants to say is actually the opposite is the case. Because if you look at the most oppressive and repressive countries in the world, places like Saudi Arabia, for instance, where women just recently, uh, gained the right, or I guess the privilege, in that country to have a driver's license. I mean, so long as they have their husband's permission, they can actually have a driver's license. Never was able to have that before. And look at a place like Saudi Arabia, where women we would argue are where a classical liberal like Altman is going to argue that they are severely oppressed and repressed, and yet pornography there is not available, right? It's illegal. Not supposed to have it there. And look at a place like the United States, where women can not only drive, but can vote, get a college education, really direct their own lives, can even be in positions of power over men. And many are in various companies, organizations, schools, institutions, what have you. Uh, so a lot more sexual equality. At the same time, in this country, there's a lot more porn. There's a lot of porn here. So what Altman is pointing out is that what the data actually shows is that countries and societies where pornography is more readily available, there is actually more sexual equality, not inequality. And then there is the third criticism, and the criticism of anti-porn advocates. It's this criticism they make. Sure, okay, sexual autonomy. Again, there's an extent to which that in and of itself is a good thing. We want to keep that. But it goes too far regarding pornography because making pornography itself is an actual instance of inequality. So think about it this way. Yeah, maybe you are a porn actor, either male or female, and you are making a pornographic film and you're on the movie set, you're doing this, and again, you are just acting. But you know what? Even though you might be just acting, there's a sense in which you're not merely just acting, especially if it's a bondage or torture scene where the female is bound and gagged and mutilated and tortured and all this sort of thing, violated, degraded, to use all of McKinnon's terms, with a blindfold on, and while there is a group of men around that are taking their turn. That is an actual, even though they might be consenting, right? The criticism is that is an actual instance of humiliating the woman in order to please the co-actors, right? To please those who are consuming this. So here, making porn itself is indeed an actual making of female inequality. It's not merely depicting it, although it is, but it's more than just depicting it. It's actually creating inequality at that time, at that place, on that movie set. Okay, well, how does Altman respond? He says, well, okay, but you've got to think about the context here. Why would some acts be more humiliating than others if people are consenting to them? Why are you making the judgment that that woman is being humiliated when she's consented to that and she's going to go home with a nice paycheck after this film has been produced for playing that role? Why is it humiliating to do something that one wants to do and indeed decides to do, even though they don't have to do it? So what Altman says, it just doesn't follow that the actors here have no right to participate in making this pornographic film, or that viewers have no right to view it. So the bottom line is this, that Altman kind of bites the bullet here, and he says, yeah, maybe some harm is done. Maybe there's some direct harm. Maybe there's some indirect harm. Maybe. Nonetheless, and it may be that these people have serious character flaws. Maybe these people are just really crappy people that are involved in this industry. But it does not negate the right that they have via their sexual autonomy to engage in it. Maybe it's harmful, but we still have a right to do it because we have a right to all of that which falls under our sexual autonomy. Now, Susan Bryson, another moral philosopher, in her article entitled The Price We Pay, Pornography and Harm, responds to Altman. And given her provocative title as well, what she means in this title, The Price We Pay, is that for sexual autonomy, if we're going to have this sort of full-blown, robust understanding of it, such as what Altman provides for us, his understanding of it, then for that sexual autonomy, including pornography, we're going to pay a really heavy price for that. And maybe the price itself is just not worth paying. How does Bryson define pornography? It's very different than Altman. Altman's trying to get down to the nuts and bolts of what pornography is and define it in sort of an essential definition. Bryson doesn't do that. She defines it in terms of her own judgment of it. She says, I define it as, quote, violent, degrading, misogynistic hate speech. So it's violent and it degrades women. It's misogynistic. It's anti-woman. It's anti-female. Hate speech. And what she argues is that it unjustly harms women. So let's think about that for a second. She says that if you actually do some research and look at how people get into pornography, and by the way, there's been some documentaries done. I think you can find some on YouTube. I know that Netflix had one, and I'll admit I watched one of those one time with a friend. We were thinking about this issue and doing a little bit of research, and the particular documentary on Netflix was actually fairly tasteful. There wasn't any sort of explicit stuff actually involved in that documentary. It was following those who had responded to Craigslist ads about how to make some easy money. They were flown to places like Miami or LA to do screenshots, to do a few scenes, and to see how they liked the business. Were paid very well for it, and then continued on until, for several of them, they just were having a hard time dealing with that being what they did for a living, and would go home And so it was an interesting documentary to see people in certain positions where they felt like this was the best way to try to enrich their lives because they were fairly desperate to some extent in what they were doing at home in their original life, so to say. And picking up on that theme, this is where Bryson's giving her explanation about those who are part of what she calls the common scenarios of people who get into porn. On the one hand, there's many who get into it. There's many girls who get into it after running away from home. They befriend people who seem to care about them, who take nude photos of them, who sell them to pimps, who threaten their life if they run away or get sold to another pimp who's a pornographer. And there's other girls that are looking for ads, look at ads that are looking for models. As a result, many will get into drugs just to kind of keep going and going and going. There's another interesting documentary out there and testimonial by Randy Spears, who is a former male porn star, has been dubbed as one of the most successful male porn stars, who said, after years of doing this, winning awards and making a lot of money, um, I developed a drug habit because I needed the drugs in order to continue doing the porn, and it was just became this never-ending cycle until I finally was able to stop and break it. That's the kind of thing Bryson's talking about there as one of the common scenarios, and in no way would any of us call that healthy. So the fact that that is a common scenario, that's a common story about how people get trapped into actually doing and producing porn, should in of itself seem to be morally problematic for us. Secondly, there's also the common scenario of sex trafficking, where many young girls are lured to other parts of the world with promises of employment. We're going to give you a job here, but when they get there, they end up with no money. They end up with no, as Bryson puts it, no legal papers, no family or friends, no way to speak the local language. And so, what are they left with? Well, they're left with being bought and sold at the mercy of those who buy and sell them and pimp them out, and so they end up being trafficked. It's a real travesty here where I'm doing this lecture from, which is about 40 miles north of Birmingham, Alabama. The I-20 corridor between Atlanta and Birmingham is known as one of the hotspot areas for sex trafficking in the entire South, which is pretty depressing, frankly. There's a lot of girls who are brought back and forth between Birmingham and Atlanta and other points along I-20 who are being sex trafficked, who are being bought and sold and used for sex. Many of those are being bought and sold and used also for porn, for amateur pornography, which I've been told by some people actually raises a higher price on the market than your standard Hollywood stuff, whatever that means. That's how an acquaintance of mine described it once, who's done a bit of research into this. So a lot of people get trapped in it. A lot of people get trafficked in it. What about consent, though? Because that's Altman's point, right? I mean, and this is a big one. What if people do indeed choose to do it, right? I might have some problems with cigarette smoking, for instance. We know it's unhealthy. I mean, good grief, the evidence is just overwhelming. It's really hard to make the argument that smoking is not harmful. It is. It's harmful to those who engage in it, and it's harmful for those who don't engage into it, those who are indirectly harmed uh, by it, and who don't consent to be harmed by it, who don't consent to smell it in a restaurant or in a car with somebody else who's smoking, right? I mean, we know that it's harmful, but at the same time, right, those who do consent to it, it's hard to say that they don't have a right to. It's hard to say they don't have a right to consent to how they want to live their life, if that includes smoking cigarettes. What Bryson says, however, regarding porn is that it's just not enough to say that porn participants consent to it. Even though some may do, we got to think about how it impacts people who don't consent to it. And one of the examples she gives here, well, let me say this first. And what she means by other non-consenting women are just women in the world, the vast majority of women in the world. How would it be right to say that that porn is okay so long as people consent to it, when there's a lot of women who are affected by pornography, by their boyfriends, husbands, other males, co-workers, for instance? This is a huge problem, sexual harassment in the workplace. Women who are sexually harassed day in and day out by men who are, frankly, addicted to porn, or maybe not even have developed an addiction, but just have watched so much porn that that has influenced the way they think about women. And so women who haven't consented to porn, who haven't consented to be um, sufferers of the effects of other people's porn habits, indeed are suffering the effects of that. How is it fair to them? Right? Here's a really good example of indirect harm experienced. The example that Bryson gives is really provocative. And here's what she gives. Think about, for instance, if we had a subgenre of films, such that in this particular subgenre of films, blacks consented to playing the part of slaves who are humiliated, beaten, and whipped for the pleasure of their masters, right, on film. But let's suppose that the reason why these kinds of films are filmed, why they're created, is because a lot of whites get off on this kind of stuff, she says, and it becomes a huge money-making industry. And let's suppose that everybody involved, all of the blacks playing the subordinate ones that are beaten and and humiliated and whipped, as well as the whites who are doing the beating, the humiliating, and the whipping, right, on the camera, on the movie set, that all of these people are fully consenting to doing this. Bryson asks, wouldn't this make it harder for blacks to overcome the brutal and ongoing legacy we continue to deal with in this country of hate and oppression against blacks, against African Americans? Well, of course it would. It'd be very difficult to have that in a society like ours as we're trying to to increase the level of racial reconciliation that we have in our country. Would we tolerate it? Bryson thinks that we wouldn't tolerate it, that this would just be going way too far. And if we think that that's going way too far, allowing that kind of subgenre of film to take hold, then why do we still allow pornography to take hold? Why do we still allow that? Especially explicit, uh, uh, really hardcore pornography. If we don't like the thing regarding the subgenre of racial violent film, then we should also we have to apply the logic to violent porn, and that would be morally problematic as well. That's the basis of her argument, and now what she wants to do in this last part of her paper is talk about this thing called a moral right to pornography. Right? Do we really have it? Does all free speech, or does all speech, is all speech, should all speech be free? Sorry, I'll get this figured out and how to say it at some point. We prioritize this right that we have to free speech and to sexual autonomy and to all these things, but should it all really deserve protection? Now let's remember what Altman argued. He says, if harm does result from porn, then that's just the price we pay for sexual autonomy. Pornography being one aspect of that. Even if it's a sign of bad character, even if some people indeed are harmed to some extent by it, that's unfortunately, right, that's the corollary to having rights. Sometimes people get harmed, right? The right to smoking cigarettes, the right to having the ability to make your own autonomous decision about your tobacco use. Sometimes there's harm involved. Sometimes there's bad consequences. That's just the price we pay for having freedom. But Bryson says that this is where Altman goes wrong, because he thinks that the right to sexual autonomy is the overarching category under which everything sexual falls under, including pornography. But Bryson rejects this. She says this really muddies the waters here. One example she gives is really, well, there's three criticisms that Bryson brings up here in response to Altman. And she does this in terms of three different questions, right? So let's talk about the first question now. This would be a question to Altman, and it's kind of a rhetorical question. The first one is to Altman: where should the right of pornography be located on the spectrum of moral assessment? So let's think about, for instance, if I had this line going from left to right on the screen right now, and on this line, um, we were to place towards the right on this spectrum, on this line, those things that we think are morally better, and to the left, those things that we think are morally worse. So, something like helping little old ladies cross the street, for instance, we think that that's a good thing to do. That would be more along the side of the line that is a morally better action. Stealing someone's lunch money, you'd probably say that that's more on the other side of the line of moral spectrum, right? The sort of thing that's more in the direction of being morally worse. And we could put all sorts of things on there. Now, here's the thing about how rights and morality work, or at least one of the aspects, one thing about how rights and morality work. We usually tend to think, and rightly, I would say, that someone indeed has the right to do what is morally right, what is morally correct, and as such, you and I have no business. Frankly, we have an obligation not to uh, in any way interfere with that. So if somebody's wanting to help a little lady cross the street, man, I've got a moral obligation to stay out of the way. If anything, to even help if my help is needed. But I definitely shouldn't go and tell them they shouldn't do that, or try to stand in the way, or in any way prohibit or attempt to prohibit this person from helping out, from doing a morally good thing. Well, here's the example that Bryson gives. She says, suppose I have a 21-year-old son who loves porn. That's his hobby, right? Maybe that's even he wants a birthday party with this theme, right? And he goes to Walmart and gets the porn cake, right? And this is what this guy is into. What does his right to that entail, right? I oppose it, let's say. Wouldn't that mean I'm not under any obligation then to supply him with it? But does that entail then I'd have a right to not keep him from viewing it? Right? It's just not, Bryson says it's not clear what this right means. But it does seem that it's not the same sort of right that one has for contraceptives, right? Or the same sort of right that one has for to do morally good things like helping little ladies cross the street, or giving to charity, or giving to a worthy cause, right? So we got this intuition that even if one has a right to it, it's going to be completely on the other side of the moral spectrum than all sorts of other things. And with those other things, it seems like I'm morally obligated to not stand in the way. And yet when it comes to pornography, there's a sense in which I don't have that same sort of strong feeling of obligation. So there's an interesting problem here to try to figure out. A second criticism Bryson raises is in terms of this question. Is there anything special about arousal that gives it a special moral status? One of the things that Altman has not been able to prove, has not said, is what makes arousal itself, sexual arousal, so different morally from other kinds of arousal, like racial animus, uh, like the example given earlier about having the subgenre of films where people get off on a certain kind of race being beaten and humiliated by another race. Um, what if someone like Altman, or anybody else would say that the racial film there, it just goes too far? Well, then what makes sexual arousal from pornography different than arousal from the sort of racial subgenre of film where everybody has their clothes on, right? Um, Someone like Altman's going to say that there's a general right to liberty, and hence you have the right to be turned on. But what Bryson says is that there is no general right to have pleasurable feelings of any kind. In other words, you don't have the right to have the warm fuzzies if indeed other people are harmed. So the right to have pleasurable feelings of any kind does not override others' rights to not be harmed in any way. The third and last criticism that Bryson raises in response to Altman and directs to Altman is that, okay, someone like Altman wants to say that, bodily pleasures indeed are very personal, they're very specific, and so that right itself might be very special. It's a special kind of right that one has regarding their own person, regarding their own privacy. The Supreme Court many years ago said that we have a right to privacy, and they abstracted that principle out from the Constitution and from previous case examples. It's not explicitly in the Constitution itself. They abstracted that in a very sort of Kantian way. So if you have a right to privacy, you have the right to yourself. You have the right to whatever bodily pleasure that is. Um, does that mean that whatever gives your body pleasure would give you a special right to achieve that in any way? And of course, what Bryson wants to say is no, absolutely not. Right? For example, you don't have the right to eat whatever you want to eat just because it gives you pleasure, especially if you're a cannibal, right? Living in the United States, right? You just can't go around eating people, right? That's a very extreme example. But nonetheless, it kind of proves the point for Bryson that bodily pleasure in and of itself isn't sovereign. It isn't special. It isn't immutable, right? It can be problematic. And so what Bryson says is, given what we know about our psychology, our social conditioning, given what we know about people, anything could be a turn on. Anything could be arousal or could cause arousal for somebody. All kinds of craziness. And she gives some examples that I really don't want to mention here in this lecture. But go back and read the piece, you know what I'm talking about. And Bryson says that of all these kinds of things that could arouse men pornographically, if Altman is right, that all these kinds of movies or photographs that would portray this stuff are morally protected. And she just says, no, it can't be. It can't be the case. It'd be too high of a price to pay. Too many harms would result from that. Anyway, this was an interesting couple of arguments to think through and talk about. I hope that you have maybe enjoy is not the right exact kind of word, but maybe you've enjoyed. I hope you've enjoyed the lecture, have enjoyed the readings. Again, pornography is one of those things that maybe not the most interesting way to interesting thing to think about per se, or the lovely thing to think about. Um, but statistics would actually tell me that about 68% of you listening to this lecture have viewed pornography in the last few days. Um, so you know who you are. I won't point it out because I don't, frankly. But maybe this helps you take another spin on the role of pornography in our society and whether or not there is any sort of ethical obligation to either promote it as free speech, as sexual autonomy, or to take seriously the alleged and with good evidence harms that it does bring about in certain people and in certain parts of our society. As always, if you have any questions or thoughts, please feel free to email me, and I'd be glad to get back to you on those. Have a good rest of your day.